Oh, an error occurred. Looks like we're live, though.
Yeah,
hopefully we're live. My apologies. I was getting a strange error message, and I've been having some very strange issues with my my browsers lately. So hopefully that will not impede us. I am super excited about today's conversation. My name is Jesse Clarke, and I'm the founder of JNC Clarke Consulting, and we specialize in providing information and tools and skills to Canada's nonprofit sector to make their work with government more effective. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by Kim Peterson. This is week 5 in our fall series of LinkedIn Lives, where we're bringing all kinds of topics of interest to the nonprofit sector in Canada. And Kim also has her own shop where she offers all kinds of expert advice to particularly small nonprofits on a wide range of different fundraising areas and goals, and certainly has worked on her share of government grants as well. And today we're going to talk about kind of all things government grants, some tips and tricks, and some things to keep in mind when you're making a decision about whether to apply, and also to hear some Kim's reflections as well from her experience. So, Kim, I want to give you just a couple of minutes, first of all, to introduce yourself more than I was able to do, and tell us a bit more about your background and your work that you're doing right now as well.
For sure. Thanks, Jesse. My name is Kim Peterson, and I am in Vancouver, BC. My business is called Cedar Fundraising, and I am a solo person shop. I work as a fractional fundraiser, and I also do fundraising for doing campaign work. So helping people raise money online, or helping nonprofit organizations raise money online through campaigns. And in my past, I have done a lot of grant writing. I still do a lot of grant writing for my clients, but it's not a service by itself that I offer anymore. But it's kind of where, I guess, the bulk of my fundraising experience is in, especially in-house experience, was in grant writing. So I've done a lot of government grants over the years, and I thought this was a great time for the conversation because it just seems like fall is like the time for federal grants, especially. There's so many coming down the pipe. It's a little overwhelming. So that's me.
Yeah, no, and there's been a bit of an explosion of grants lately, I've noticed, in terms of certainly with wage. I mean, wage has been fairly consistent, but they've got some interesting new ones that have come out. Environment and Climate Change Canada, Global Affairs, which we also work with fairly often as well. They've got a couple of different ones. And that's just sort of scratching the surface. There's a lot more going on as well. And I think it's interesting because one of the things actually that we talk about in the course that I've been running is why fall is such a kind of high priority time for governments to try and get some of this budget money locked down, make some decisions prior to the end of their fiscal year as well. But yeah, it can be overwhelming though when you're faced with different opportunities for grants. You might not have a huge amount of in-house capacity, and you need to try and make a decision about whether or not you should go for this kind of grant. I don't know if that's a situation that you've run into before, Kim.
Oh yeah,
in terms of your clients, your own work.
Yeah, I mean the organizations I work with are typically small in that they don't have development staff in-house. So that's where I come in and I'm helping out. And sometimes there will be multiple opportunities, which is great. But you're right, it can be really overwhelming because you want to make the right decision. Sometimes you can't do everything. So you want to make sure you're making the most strategic decision and also the best decision for your team in terms of the time that's involved, both during the grant writing process and like post award. If you make it through the whole process and you get the award, like it can be a pretty big deal for smaller organizations. Some of these larger grants come through, even I would say like the medium to large, it can be a really big deal. So it really deserves a lot of thinking prior to even opening up the application for the first time, I'd say.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's sometimes, what I've seen over the years is understandably, I think nonprofits, obviously you see money that's on offer on the table. You get excited, especially if there seems to be some kind of fit with your existing programming. And I think there's often a tendency to just run after all of the different funding. But for me, it's really a sign of also of organizational growth and maturity when you can, and obviously some degree of, of stability as well, when you can step back and say, okay, what is this the right opportunity for us, or should we be looking into something else? And one of the things that I've recommended a lot to people when they're sort of first looking for government funding, because it can be very overwhelming, and we can maybe talk in a minute about like where to find information on funding, because that's another area of interest. But when you see an opportunity, I think there's a couple of questions that you need to address right off of the top. And the first one is eligibility, which should be straightforward, but it's not always straightforward at all. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, you only find the information you need, 4 or 5 pages down in the description of an RFP. But I think that's something that's kind of the first thing to really carefully consider. Make sure that you are as your organization is eligible, and then not just eligible, but are you eligible and also probably competitive as well for this opportunity? So that can take some reflection. That can also look at, is this an area? Is this benefiting people that in a community that you serve already? Is it a specific kind of organization that the government's looking to fund? And do you fit that criteria? Are there any kind of sort of financial requirements in terms of a certain number of years of audited financial statements or a budget level? There's a lot of basic criteria like that again, it might seem basic, but sometimes actually that is a first step, can be very, very challenging, in terms of eligibility. I if there's something you've run into as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's always the first thing. And it's something that you can't fake it, Yeah. I think whether or not it's explained to you, the eligibility is there for a reason. And the people who are reviewing these grants, like, they're not going to let things go past them, right? I mean, that's the government's job. It's bureaucracy, right? It's like rules are rules, exactly. Right? So, I mean, especially even for some of the provincial things, like we've got the gaming grant out here in BC, and I know in Ontario there's the Trillium Foundation, which is very similar. You're right, like buried in there's those eligibility pieces that, like, if it's not a fit, then I always just say, like, it's not your time, it's not your grant. Like, put your time and resources elsewhere, because it's just not going to work. So yeah, once you pass that first hurdle, I always look at project eligibility as well. So in terms of like that organizational piece, and then also the project or the program, I mean, they're pretty key and high up there. The first thing I always do is look at that applicant guide, and just pour through it and print it out if I have to. Yes. With my highlighter. Like when I was working in-house and I had access to a printer, I was pretty ruthless with it. I would just, sit there and write.
Well, there's a time and a place for it, right? Definitely. And then absolutely, if you're trying to get all those details and make sure you're absolutely certain, that's definitely one of those times to print things out. I understand that.
Yeah. It was a bit of a hard habit to break, to be honest. But go through that applicant guide multiple times, because you're right. Like they bury stuff in there for whatever reason. It can be confusing. Like there can be seemingly contradictory pieces as well. And so it's worth it to take the time and kind of pull at those threads at the beginning and just make sure that you're going into the process eyes wide open, I suppose.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than putting all the work into preparing a proposal, submitting it, and then getting tossed out early on for eligibility requirements, which I have sadly seen on occasion as well, which is, it's awful. You think about all the work that was put into it in the planning, and then just because one particular piece was missed, it's sometimes that in and of itself can just be an automatic, kind of kick you out. Depending on the grant, I think sometimes government funders these days, it's interesting because I think they are trying definitely to adopt some practices that are a bit more partner friendly. So I have seen some calls where they'll say, if you're missing something, we'll give you 5 business days to supply it, for example. But there's no guarantee that you're in one of those situations either. So yeah, it's definitely something to think carefully about. And then, yeah, you were mentioning around kind of project alignment and this whole idea. I think for me too, there's a big question about when you're embarking on a government grant. I've developed this kind of series of things of questions to reflect on, and one of them is around, is what you're going to be proposing, is this aligned with your organization's strategic direction, or is it going to require a major shift in priorities and activities? And then also, if this shift is required, is this an area where you were hoping to expand and already planning to expand your work? And what is the cost really to the organization of that kind of expansion? Because I think that's also, really critical, because sometimes, yeah, it's great on paper. You want to expand to this new community, but have you actually thought through like all of the associated costs with starting a new program, and will the government cover all of those, right?
Yeah. At the start, it can be so exciting. Like, you see the potential, and I mean, a part of me wants, like, the risk taker in me is always like, yeah, let's go for it. But then, I mean, you always have to kind of like invite that practical side in as well, to be like, okay, wait a second. Like, is this a thing that we want to do? Really? Is this a thing that we can do? One thing I've seen come up is, like, the pieces are all in place, but in the end, it was so hard to find, say, somebody to fill a position that they needed. Like, it needed to be a very specific person or a group of people that needed to come in and do this work. And that was where the challenge was. And that's where they kind of ran into some problems. So there's a whole bunch of factors involved in that.
Yeah, I find also these like having, if there's a requirement that you have a strong local partnership, again, it's like, if you have that already, great. But if you're moving into a new area, or if this is, it's just something you're still developing, that can be a big challenge as well when it comes to actually implementing. So that's certainly something else to think about in terms of kind of, one of the things I like to think about is like, there's kind of 2 levels of opportunity costs. So it's like, okay, if my organization takes on writing this proposal and developing it, first of all, it's kind of that consideration. It's like, well, what are we not going to be able to do because we're focusing on this, our time on this? Like, what are we going to have to leave to what other fundraising activities are we going to have to not do because we're putting all of our time and energy into this grant? Because time and capacity is finite, right? So as much as maybe we sometimes like to think that it's not, I think that's probably one of the problems of our sector, but it is. And so, if you're doing that, then you're not doing something else, right? And then. And if you don't feel like you have the in-house capacity, so you feel like you might need to hire somebody, do you have the necessary budget? I mean, that's another kind of opportunity cost. And then finally, I would say too, if you then you're successful in the opportunity and you take that on, what are the trade-offs there in terms of things you're not going to be able to necessarily deliver on that you're planning to do? So I think there's a lot around opportunity costs. I don't know if you have sort of reflections for people when they're thinking about whether they have in-house capacity, how to kind of work with that or work with other people as well in those areas.
Yeah, I try to be pretty upfront about the time that it takes to write one of these grants. I mean, in recent years, because I haven't been in-house, it's a bit of a different situation, because I'll come into an organization, so I don't know the full landscape, whether there's support here or there, and what they can commit to. Because even as somebody who's delivering this service, like I will need to rely on their expertise and their sort of background and historical knowledge of the organization. So it's a group effort for sure. So I'm pretty upfront about the time it takes to do one of these federal grants. And for me, if I'm doing the whole thing, it could be upwards of, between 25 and 30 hours to put together something that's really high quality. So yeah, you have to kind of factor that stuff in, definitely. But I mean, with all these sort of dire warnings about capacity and things like that, like I also feel like going through this process and doing these grants are a growth opportunity for an organization, especially if they maybe haven't done one before. I see benefits to doing this work, even when you're not successful.
Totally. No, totally. There's a certain kind of I mean, in some cases, first of all, it's just an opportunity to develop all of the tools you need. For example, do you have, an external evaluation of your work? Do you have, the kinds of letters of support from community members, and just getting all of that in place, first of all. But I think also the kind of planning process that you sometimes go through, especially for bigger opportunities, it can really help with, kind of impose a bit of a rigor around planning that can be beneficial, for sure. I mean, as much as it can be onerous as well. But I think you're right. I think there's a way to really, there's ways to really reap a benefit from that also as an organization.
Yeah. And if it is aligned with your strategic plan, so you're growing this, high level idea and kind of working out the details, that's development. And if it's not going to work out for this opportunity, then once you have everything in place, there's a chance that it will be a good fit for another opportunity down the line. And for one of the biggest grants that I've ever written, for a federal grant, that's exactly what happened. We had put together a whole new program, or I think it was an expansion of a program, put all the details in place, and then it fell through at the last minute. 6 months later, this other opportunity came by, and we just had everything ready to go, and it was really successful. Amazing. So I try to instill caution. Yeah. But I also say I'm also a bit of a cheerleader. Like, there's opportunities here that might not be completely apparent at this point. So it's good work to do.
No, and I think often, I mean, if you put the work in and prepared something really solid, then it's true. It's a great resource that you now have, or an asset that you can repurpose for other funders if that's what it comes to, as an organization. That's a great example. One of the other things that I think sometimes organizations struggle with, and I think actually this is kind of like a big struggle for a lot of organizations that my firm at least is trying to address, is that where do you find information on funding opportunities? How do you find new opportunities? How do you find them in a timely manner as well? Because it's not great when you find out about one and it's due in 2 days. And I think one of the things that I run into a lot when I'm talking to people is there's so much information available. Kudos to the federal government for really making a big effort around transparency. And it's kind of unbelievable sometimes what you can find when you search. The problem is that finding it and finding the right information at the right time, and not spending, several days looking for it, that can be very challenging. And so I think it's sometimes helpful to have a few kind of tips and directions. I know from my end, I mean, starting with federally. So it's interesting because the government did create a page a few years back there's a grants funding page, and I can put a link onto it. But I do find that basically it's that even that website, unfortunately, is not always up to date. The links aren't always valid. So I think you're better off to go to each individual department's page a lot of the time. And many of the departments have some kind of list that you can subscribe to. You'll get emails in your inbox notifying you when there's new opportunities, or when they have press releases or announcements, and which are often related to new opportunities. So that's a great way to kind of make sure that you're as plugged in as possible. Obviously, I mean, social media can be helpful as well. If you follow relevant departments or officials on social media, they often will be amplifying opportunities as well. So I think that's a good starting point. I think also there's a tool that I like to highlight, and I've highlighted it a few times on LinkedIn, called it's a new tool that the government's developed. It's a GC info base, and we can post a link to it shortly. And that actually kind of walks you through, okay, each department, how do they spend their money every year? How much money have they spent on this area or that area? What are their major strategic priorities for the year? And at least it gives you a bit of a roadmap looking forward to say, okay, well, this is, it doesn't necessarily tell you like this is the RFP that's coming out, but it does give you a bit of an early signal. These are the kinds of areas they're going to be focusing on. And then from there, you can go further and dig into your relationship with government. I mean, and I would certainly say also, in terms of looking for funding opportunities, a lot of them are published, but there's also others that are just never published publicly, because they may already have a list of organizations in mind that they want to invite, or they may be people who are already part of a different list or community that they're inviting. And so, I mean, as much as that's kind of frustrating to hear, I think it's also maybe an encouragement to really be as proactive as you can be. I think people are often really afraid to reach out to government, especially when you're talking about government funding. They think, well, what if, there's some kind of conflict of interest, or I'm perceived to be, cheating somehow. And I think one of the things that I really like to emphasize, I mean, it never hurts to reach out. People, the worst thing that'll happen is they won't respond, which is sadly somewhat common. But I think, depending on who you're speaking with, but I think there's also, often you'll get a response. And if they really feel like they can't answer your question, then they'll tell you that. But at least you've established a dialogue and a relationship. And I think that's also, even when you're in the middle of applying for something, say, an RFP that's come out, it's never bad to reach out, and if there's an email address provided, to ask clarifying questions. If something's confusing, that's what they're there for, and I think it helps to signal your the seriousness of your interest in something if you do that. So,
yeah,
if you've had that kind of experience in terms of interacting with funders and lessons that you think would be relevant.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and I think sometimes, especially, I don't know if it's especially smaller organizations, but there's a reluctance to reach out, or it feels like the government is just like this big, sort of mysterious, opaque thing, totally. Right? But yes. I mean, the truth is it is full of people and people with different priorities and different sort of levels of engagement and things like that. So you're right. I mean, it doesn't hurt to reach out. I've definitely seen success, especially at the provincial level. I find that some MLAs are super responsive. So it probably totally depends on where you are.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I said that could be incredibly beneficial, and it's a relationship that you can build over the years as well, right?
No, and there's ways you can engage them, as you say. Like, I mean, that's something definitely that I say to people a lot. These are people who, they want to feel connected to the work they're doing. They want to feel excited about the work that they're funding and that partners are doing. So if there's ways you can connect them to the work, that fall within the parameters of what they can kind of, typically, I mean, I've seen some exceptions that typically maybe not inviting them to a gala necessarily, but you can send them a newsletter, you can send them information, and there may be an opportunity to have a site visit, that kind of thing. There's lots of different ways to potentially engage government officials, depending on how much time they have, how many partners they're dealing with. But even just having regular phone contact or email contact can also be, very beneficial and not necessarily cost a lot or be a really heavy lift. I think, to your point about, I talk about that a lot, that they're people, and that there's actually also, like, if you go online, you'll be amazed. I would say almost every province, and certainly the federal government have online directories of employees, which is remarkable. So you can actually go in and look and find someone's email address or phone number. And again, obviously, if you're going to do that and approach them, I mean, be thoughtful and be professional about it. But I think often that information is there, and you can say, well, look, this person's working in this general area that's of interest to us. At least reach out to them, and then even if they're not the right person, they can pass you on to someone else, or they can send you to where you can find the right information. And every opportunity is an opportunity to talk to them about your work and to talk to them about your organization. And I think, also, I mean, the government sometimes need partners who they know can deliver the results they're looking for, and they need organizations that can connect with communities more directly than they can. And so sometimes you're actually solving a problem that they have, right? Which is an ideal situation when you can do that.
They need photo ops sometimes too, right?
That's true too, definitely. Well, that's almost always part of. I mean, not always, but but I would say, funding announcements can be a big deal for sure, and can be. I guess if you're thinking about kind of the quid pro quo of funding, what are the funders getting out of it? I think with government, certainly when they can. When they can get publicity and talk about the work they're doing in a positive light, that can be really beneficial for sure for them.
Yeah. And just in terms of the grant opportunities that come up, you're right. I mean, like, sometimes they're internal or coming up and people just will give you the heads up. So it's pretty beneficial.
Yeah. And every province has, to varying degrees, has information online, I think, about opportunities. Some more than others. Some it's a bit more, kind of in-house, or you need to know who to talk to. It varies a bit, but I think, there are a lot of opportunities that are these days that are advertised because they really do want to make sure that they're reaching out to as broad a community as possible.
Yeah.
A lot of the time I find. So yeah, so it's not always easy to find things, but when you kind of get onto the right list and get in the right direction, it can be you can sometimes get overwhelmed with how much there is out there to actually learn about.
Yeah. I was shy. I'll also add there's one other database that the government provides through ESDC, Employment Social Development.
Yes,
anyway,
Employment Social Development Canada.
Yeah,
exactly.
I just remember the acronym. It's their business benefits finder, and they will put grants and funding opportunities for businesses, but also nonprofits there. And it's the nice thing about it is you can set up a profile for your organization, and they'll send you notifications when new things come up. So I've seen things come through that. Sometimes it's not perfect, but it's one that I'll use every so often.
No, that's a great tip for sure, because they walk you, as I recall, through the series of questions to say, help narrow down a little bit the focus of what you're looking for, where are you based, and then they'll give you a set of matching opportunities, and then as you say, you can get notifications as well, which can be amazing, and it's a free tool. I think that's, the other thing I would say in terms of looking for funding opportunities and understanding government funding, one of the other things I recommend is look at other organizations that are doing similar work to you. Is there any public information about where they're getting funding from? And is that something you'd also be eligible for potentially? So that's one place to look. The government actually has a grants database as well, which again is a little bit intimidating because I think it has like information for the last 15 years. The number of grants that are in there, it's like every grant over $25,000. It's massive. But if you use the right search terms, again, you can break it down to say, how many universities in Alberta receive funding, for this area of work over the last 3 years from the federal government, and you can find some really interesting information. Maybe you didn't even know the federal government was involved with this kind of, this area of work, and it's actually a really, really interesting way to think. Okay, well, if they did this before, maybe they're going to be doing it again, and at least it gives you a basis in which to reach out and say, look, I saw you funded this work previously. Is this something you're looking to fund again? So yeah, it's sort of like knowing where to look, but there's some really great information out there if you know where to look, for sure. Yeah. In terms of actually writing the grants, Kim, do you have tips about that you want to share with people in terms of things? Yeah. I know it's hard to be general because there can be very specific requirements, but just in general, like, are there things that you recommend or not recommend to people who are preparing grants?
Yes. Well, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the first thing is to give yourself enough time to do it. Like, these are not the grants to be rushing and 6 hours before the deadline. It's just not going to be pretty. So yeah, definitely block out the amount of time that you need to do it, and also the amount of time that you need to submit it. Sometimes the submission process is a little more complicated. Sometimes it's super easy. And every time I do one of these grants, I'm like, I don't understand why they don't just pick a system and do it the same everywhere.
Oh, yes.
They're totally all different. But yeah, know what you need to do to submit it. Like, because sometimes you need to sign up days in advance for an account, and anyways, so just be prepared in that sense. Give yourself a couple of extra days at the end of the whole process to make sure that goes okay. Because that's the worst, is like when something crashes and there's a panic at midnight because nothing's working. Right?
Yeah, or everyone's trying to submit at the same time, right? So the system just can't handle it.
Yeah.
If you're getting close to the deadline, yeah, that's a terrible feeling.
Yeah. And then in terms of like the actual writing itself, sort of the biggest mistakes I see is lack of clarity. Especially if it's something you know really well, or if it's something that it's an idea that isn't quite there yet. People tend to write very vaguely or high level, and it just doesn't fly on these applications. Like, they drill down into the nitty-gritty details in terms of like your work plan and your milestones. And like, if you are not clear on exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, like, it's just not going to be a high quality application.
That is such good advice. Like it's not enough to have sort of good intentions or a good idea. You have to be able to really explain very specifically, why is this a good investment for the government? Why is this aligned with their priorities? And how are you going to demonstrate value to them in terms of, how many people are you going to be able to reach for your work, for example? Or what are the kinds of results you're going to be able to show to them in your reporting? The more that you can dig into that, definitely, the better. I think that's such a good point.
Yeah. And sometimes I find, I feel like that's probably some of the best value that I provide as a consultant coming in is I'm working with leaders who are very high level thinkers. They're visionaries, right? So they tend not to kind of live in the details, which is good. I mean, like, you need people like that at your organization, but I'll come in and I'll say, okay, well, I don't understand this part. Like, how are you doing this? Like, who is actually participating in this thing? And so we can kind of pull out the details. So it works to have multiple people working on an application like that, who can kind of bounce ideas and really identify those gaps in the application. So yeah, clarity is a pretty big thing. And then also just cohesion through the grant. So like if you say you're going to be doing something in your timeline or your milestones, it should be reflected in your budget. So just so it looks like you've really thought through the whole process and have a good understanding of exactly what this project is going to be.
That's an excellent point as well. I think that's like clarity, cohesion, kind of consistency too, in terms of like when you're referring to something, making sure you're referring to it the same way, in multiple different parts of the application. And it's funny because in some ways those sound fairly basic, but it's actually, it's surprising how much of an art there is to it as well. I think, one of the things that we talk about a lot in our work is really put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's going to be reading through, 100 applications or 50 applications. You want to make it really easy for them to say yes to you, right? You don't want to make them, I mean, they might have really good, they might like your organization, they might want to be supporting your work, or they might not know you at all. But what you want to do is making yourself an easy yes for them, because they can say, oh yeah, tick, 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 this checks all these boxes of what we're looking for. It's very clearly they fit into all of these requirements. Clearly they did their homework and they read everything that we were looking for and understood it. And then they've shown us, exactly what we were looking for in terms of what they're proposing. And again, it sounds simple, but it's actually surprisingly difficult sometimes. And it can really make you stand out from a crowd, I would say. Yeah,
for sure. And always to keep in mind too, that likely the people reading through these applications are experts, so they're gonna find they're gonna really be able to flag those areas that aren't clear or don't make sense to the project that you're trying to put out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's good to have, I mean, they may, of course, they'll understand that not everybody from every organization would themselves be, maybe a technical expert, but I think they expect you, to have done a bit of homework and know the kind of basic language and vocabulary, which I think is another thing that may be a barrier for people. Sometimes government, seems to use its own kind of special language that's not always necessarily clear. And I think it just takes practice, reading through it and, learning, talking to people who work in government as well, and making sure you're understanding what is really the intent behind what it is they're putting out.
Yeah.
We've somehow amazingly made it already spoken for half an hour. I could easily keep going as well, because this is a great conversation, Kim. Are there other things you think that we want to make sure we highlight for people listening, who may be thinking about applying for some of the many, many government grants that are out there right now? Any other recommendations you'd give them or suggestions?
Yeah, I put some notes together, so I'm just looking through my notes to make sure. Because I could talk about grants all day probably. I think just to kind of circle back onto something I had talked about before in terms of just that value of actually doing the work in terms of strategically and thinking through things. Like, I think that's probably the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years is just how valuable these opportunities are, not just, in terms of the money that can come through, but also just the experience for your organization. So I don't know, like, get your feet wet, I think. Like, give it a try if you haven't already. And also,
sometimes this can be transformational. Yes, and we can help you. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, oh man, finding a grant writer, I think it's tough. Like it's a skill that it's a job that it's special. Like a lot of fundraisers kind of loved, that we're relationship people, we're people, right? So people, they tend to kind of gravitate towards that end of fundraising. So the people who are writing the grants and who have a lot of experience with it tend to be a little fewer and further between. So if you find somebody who is great, like hold on to them.
Yeah, definitely. No, and I think it's also like ideally with government relations, you want to try and combine, a bit of both of those things. You want to make sure you have people who can build the relationships, and also, bring the technical heavy lifting, which is not always easy to find as well, as you're saying. Get people who can do all of that for you, and it can really push you forward in terms of your success, because I think these grants can be, I mean, it really varies, and I mean, smaller 1-year grants, maybe not as strategic, but there are some other multi-year grants that can be really impactful for organizations and really fund work that other funders may not necessarily support. So it can be really exciting as well. And I mean, we've seen that with the Community Service Recovery Fund, where they've been funding some of the non-traditional things that funders don't always fund, for example, which has been exciting to see, and exciting to see the impact that's going to be having on the sector. Yeah, so I think, as you're saying, it's definitely worth looking into it and exploring, and learning more, and definitely, follow us and Kim as well, to learn more about some of the opportunities that are coming out there. There's a few. I know there's a number of other good people out there who do grant work. There's actually a Grant Professionals Association now, I think, in Canada, for grant writers, and so there's some really interesting stuff going on. And consider whether, I mean, sometimes the investment might be really worthwhile if it's going to lead to a really, really big grant down the road, and also just good learning for your organization as well. So, Kim, before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, if people aren't connected to me already, they can find me here on LinkedIn. My website is cedarfundraising.ca. Maybe after the conversation, I'll plug in some of the things I talked about, like where to find the grants and any other sort of helpful resources that I have in my files. I might be able to find something. Yeah. And I think that's it. That's all. This was
amazing.
Fun.
Well, it's great. Well, it was great. It's great to have you on, and great to have this conversation. And yeah, Kim, thank you for coming on, relatively early in the morning from BC, but also, good to know too, if you're looking for BC specific expertise and funding, Kim's a great person to reach out to as well. And please join us again. We have another great conversation coming up next week. With this time, I think, focusing on a new resource that's being developed for nonprofits in Canada. But all of this is here really just to offer you some additional value and hopefully help you in your work. And good luck with your next week. I hope it goes really well. And Kim, thank you again. It was really great to have you on, and great to have this conversation, and really, and good to learn from your own experience as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. It's taking its time to end.
Oh, I was looking at the comments here. I can't chat in the comments. I've been seeing the comments. Thanks, everyone.